I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's panel conversation with Joy Bivins, Elizabeth Hutton Turner, and Stephen Locke, held on the momentous occasion of Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle. This special touring exhibition brings together the last narrative epic cycle, Struggle, from the history of the American people, created by Jacob Lawrence at the start of the modern civil rights movement, and explores its contemporary resonances with work by artists Bethany Collins, Derek Adams, and Hank Willis Thomas. As many of you may know, this is an exciting moment that celebrates the reunion of the panels and their original captions for the first time in more than half a century. What might we discover by reconstituting the lost narrative? How can close looking help us to unpack the complexities stirring within Lawrence's boldly choreographed and emotionally charged scenes from American history? And finally, what truths might the interplay of word and image reveal to us about our shared past that continue to strike a chord in today's world? We have a wonderful mix of panelists with us to share their unique insights into just these questions. There's still so much to learn and discover, and we look forward to a lively conversation. Our format will consist of short PowerPoint presentations from each speaker, followed by a moderated conversation, and then question and answers with the audience. Please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A tab on the webinar while you are listening to the presentations. Before introducing the panelists, I would like to extend a few thank yous on behalf of the Phillips Collection. First, we greatly acknowledge the dedicated work of the organizing curatorial team in bringing this project to fruition. Co-curators Elizabeth Hutton Turner and Austin Barron Bailey, and coordinating curator Lydia Gordon. Special thanks also to the lenders for making this reunion possible, including Harvey Ross, who graciously shared his 15 panels from the series and has been a stalwart champion of its study and presentation. And now a few words about each of our distinguished panelists in speaking order. This past June, Joy Bivins was named the director of the internationally renowned Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library and a leading repository for archival materials related to African diaspora, and African American life, history, and culture. Prior to her appointment, Bivins served as the Schomburg's Associate Director of Collections and Research Services. Previously, she held positions as the Chief Curator of the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, and the Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Chicago History Museum. Bivins has nearly 2 decades of expert leadership and extensive curatorial knowledge in the art and culture of the African diaspora. She holds degrees from the University of Michigan and Cornell University and is a proud native of the South Side of Chicago. Elizabeth Hutton Turner is a university professor in the Department of Art at the University of Virginia. She previously served as the university's first provost for the arts. From 2013 to 2015, Turner took leave from the university to assume a position as Vice President for Collections and Curatorial Affairs at the Terra Foundation for American Art. At the university, Turner has launched a series of courses in object-based research related to experiential learning. Alongside her teaching, she continues to curate national and international touring shows, including a Calder retrospective and the current Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle. Prior to her appointment at UVA, Turner was a distinguished senior curator at the Phillips Collection, where she helped establish an interdisciplinary center for the study of modern art and organized more than 25 exhibitions that explored major topics in European and American modernism. A professor of fine arts at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, Stephen Locke is a New York-based artist whose paintings, drawings, sculptures, and installations look critically at our shared history. Locke grew up in Detroit, Michigan. He received an MFA from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design and attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 2002. Locke has received grants from the Pollock Krasner Foundation, the Tiffany Foundation, the Art Matters Foundation, among others. His work's been featured in numerous solo exhibitions, including at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum, Institute of Contemporary Art, Boston, and Museum of Contemporary Art, Detroit. He has done projects with Four Freedoms, the Boston Public Library, Brazil's Mendes Wood Art Gallery, and Volta 5 in Switzerland, among numerous others. Widely published, Locke contributed the essay, I Too Sing America, to the award-winning catalog accompanying Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to you, Joy, to start off this wonderful program. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Elsa. I'm going to share my screen and do the necessary kind of awkward things that happen at these PowerPoint presentations on Zoom. And I hope you all can see it. I will start this. Shoot. Okay, my bad. We're here now. So good afternoon, everyone that I cannot see. I'm so happy to be here to participate in this panel and to begin this conversation, or to be a part of this conversation today about Jacob Lawrence's struggle series. I'm going to do something a little bit different than what I think my colleagues on the panel will be doing. And I'm going to speak specifically about the Schomburg Center collections, the crossover between archives and art practice, and the ways in which that has manifested itself over the years at the Schomburg Center. Before I begin today, I do want to take a moment just to do a couple of housekeeping things for me. The first is to always call an ancestor's name, and today I call the name of Lucille Whipper, a giant titan of civil rights in Charleston, South Carolina, who just passed recently, and I just want to acknowledge her presence and her work. The second thing I want to do is, it is August 28th, a very critical and significant day for African Americans. And the first event I want to call to notice here today is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which took place in 1963 on the Mall in Washington, DC, very apropos within the concept or the construct of struggle. And the second is as important but darker, and that is the life and legacy of Emmett Louis Till, who was murdered today on August 28th in 1955, during the time which Jacob Lawrence was composing his struggle series. So that always helps to ground me in the reality and the truth of the work that we do. And I wanted to start there. I'm borrowing really from the work of some orators that I enjoy, and those are preachers who often use definitions to start their sermons. And I wanted to start here because struggle has many definitions. It's also a noun, it's also a verb. And I wanted to focus specifically on something that I think has happened at the Schomburg Center, and that is the act of strongly motivated striving. That strongly motivated striving has been to construct and to intervene and to add to the narrative of not only US history, but world history, the contributions of people of African descent. And since Mr. Lawrence spent so much time at the Schomburg Center, I want to make sure that you all know what we do, what was done when he was working, and what we continue to do which is part of our legacy and our contribution. So this is an image that I myself took a couple of months ago of the exterior of the Schomburg Center, but then it really fit well as we kind of travel back in time. So this is our current location at 135th Street and Malcolm X Boulevard in Harlem, New York City. And I wanted to take a moment because I don't know what you know about the Schomburg Center, but I wanted to ground us in the work that we do. And that has been the work that we've done for almost 100 years. The Schomburg Center is one of 4 research libraries within the larger New York Public Library system. Our collection is comprised of 11 million, objects in 5 separate divisions. Our primary focus is collecting and documenting the histories and cultures of people of African descent. And the foundational collection of the Schomburg was the personal collection of bibliophile and diaspora collector Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, whose image you can see here. So I mentioned that we have 5 divisions. I'll run quickly through those. Art and artifacts, which is a collection of fine art, applied art, material culture objects. So if we have 3-dimensional objects, they are in this particular division. Some of the highlights of that collection include Augusta Savage, Aaron Douglas. We have a strong Black arts movement representation. There are textiles. There are also ephemera and posters. The Jean Blackwell Research and Reference, which is our general reference collection. And this is where you would find books, journals, newspaper, the microform that is cited within the struggle catalog. There's an emphasis here on humanities, the social sciences, and the arts. The highlights are West Indian history and culture, Haitian literature and history, African-American Freemasons, as well as African-American Greek letter organizations. Manuscripts, archives, and rare books constitutes the largest portion of the Schomburg collection. And this is where you're going to find your personal papers, organizational records, literary and scholarly typescripts, manuscripts, so on and so forth. There is an emphasis on history, literature, politics, and culture of people of African descent in the Americas, Africa, and England, and primarily in the 20th century. Some of the highlights of that collection include James Baldwin's papers, I.C. Davis and Ruby Dee's papers, Malcolm X collection, Lorraine Hansberry's papers, Sonny Rollins' papers, along with countless other luminaries within the history of the African diaspora people. One of our later divisions, collecting divisions, is moving image and recorded sound. And this includes 5,000 cubic feet documenting major historical and cultural moments and influencers of the 20th century. One of the highlights of this particular collection is the only existing film clip of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. This image is a still pulled from that film clip. It is without audio, so we don't know what he sounded like, but we understand what the work that he was doing through this film clip. He's joined here by the New York Public Library's first African-American librarian, Catherine Latimer. And I'm pointing these things out to you because they'll become even more important as we move through the presentation. Finally, another robust collection within the Schomburg Center's history is the Photographs and Prints collection. It houses over 300,000 items. Our holdings date from the 18th century to the present, strongest in 20th century. We house some of the earliest photographic techniques, whether that's daguerreotype, ambrotype, stereograph. All of those are capturing Black life in the late 19th century. Some of the highlights include the Malcolm X photograph collection, Austin Hanson's collection of images of Harlem life, and the Morgan and Marvin Smith collection. So this is the Schomburg day. This is after nearly a century of collecting, shaping, and archive that has been readily available to our users and our patrons since 1926, really, when the Schomburg Collection became part of the New York Public Library. So I showed you the image of what Schomburg is now, and I want to introduce you to what Mr. Lawrence may have seen in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, as a student or as a researcher at the Schomburg. So the image on my left is the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. And that was founded in 1925. This image here, this middle building, which still exists, this is our landmark building, which houses the moving image and recorded sound and art and artifacts collections, is what was available to Harlemites, the branch that was available to Harlemites in the 1930s, the 40s, and the 50s. On my right, what you have is a division of the Negro literature, history, and prints, which is a special collection housed at the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. Ultimately, this is Schomburg's collection. This is a collection that he sold to the New York Public Library, which becomes the confluence of both volumes, texts, papers, artwork, three-dimensional objects, and so on and so forth, which are the C collection of today's Schomburg Center. You may be familiar with this image on the left, and this is the interior view of the Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints. Ultimately, again, the Schomburg Collection. So here we have patrons studiously researching, studiously doing their work, and under the watchful eye of Catherine Latimer, who I introduced to you earlier as the first African-American librarian at the New York Public Library. And then here we have the interior of the 135th Street branch. So there's both the special collections, but there's also the branch library, which, as we all know, was a circulating library. I wanted to ground you in where this work that Mr. Lawrence took place. So earlier at the beginning of this, we started with the image of Crispus Attucks, the first person killed in the American Revolutionary struggle. And part of that research was done in what existed as the vertical file, clipping files, compiled by Schomburg librarians beginning in the 1930s. So all together, what the Schomburg Center, what the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library stood for, or represented, or created, was a compilation of all of the things, the events, the people, the parties, everything that was critical to African Americans. This didn't necessarily exist all in one place. And so the librarians went ahead and compiled newspaper clippings from throughout Harlem, other parts of the country, and ultimately created a huge vertical file, which now exists as microfilm, and is a magnificent resource for those who want to know about the happenings, what was happening within Black communities, what was being written about Black historic actors. And so this image, which I cribbed from the American Struggle, the American Struggle catalog, represents that. The vertical file no longer exists as a tangible object or an object, but it does exist on microfilm and is still a magnificent resource for those who are interested in the past. So that leads me to this idea that I'll talk a little bit about as we move forward, and I hope I don't run out of time, and that is the constructing of a Black past. Part of the reason for the Schomburg Collection, its existence, was Mr. Schomburg's insistence that Black folks did contribute to not only the history of the United States or the Caribbean, where he was from, but to world history in general. And so his project was to go about collecting objects, books, papers of those folks who represented a Black past that he was told as a child did not exist. That work continues today at the Schomburg Center, and the librarians, many of whom are nameless, did this work to compile these resources for researchers who were doing both and art, who were doing their own particular scholarly research. And all of this fused together with the other aspects of the Schomburg Collection. So some of the things that I pulled from the panels, or the panels that I pulled, really for me represent the heart of the American struggle, which is identifying people who are often written out of the narrative of American history. And so this image, this panel of And a Woman, Manza Cannon, which represents Margaret Corbin at the Battle of Fort Washington, taking over for her husband, is one of those that spoke to me very particularly, not just because of what it was referencing here, but what I think it references as I talk about the Schomburg Center. So the Schomburg Center had 2 curators prior to the woman I'm about to speak about. The first was Arturo Schomburg himself, and then the second was Dr. Lawrence Redditt. In 1948, Jean Blackwell Hudson became the curator of the Schomburg Collection, and she finished her career in 1980 as the chief of the Schomburg Center. During that time, the Schomburg Collection became the Schomburg Center. The 135th Street branch library, which housed that collection, became a research library within the New York Public Library system. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight her, because I think, like Margaret Corbin, her name is not always referenced as it should in the creation and the building of this institution. So it's under her leadership that the collection comes to international prominence. She cultivates relationships to build the archives in an exponential fashion. Under her leadership, the 135th Street branch becomes the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And here she is having a conversation with a friend, Langston Hughes, at the Schomburg Collection in Harlem in 1954. That is a relationship she cultivated to at least secure a portion of Langston Hughes' papers for the archives. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but the other panel that I wanted to focus on is For Freedom We Want, or panel 27, with the quote, "For freedom we want and will have, for we have served this cruel land long enough." And this is about, a revolt, a slave revolt that did not happen, a thwarted slave revolt. And one of the things that the Schomburg Center's collections attempts to do is to answer questions about the Black past and about Black resistance and about the ways in which Black people contributed to the definitions that we have of democracy today. And so this one spoke again to the project of the Schomburg, which is to uncover those ideas or those events which are not necessarily always part of the American historical narrative. And finally, in thinking about Mr. Lawrence's relationship with the Schomburg, I wanted to end with this image of the Schomburg Library created between 1986 and 1987, a part of his library series, and really showing the bustling activity that happened within the Schomburg when he was doing his research, and which continues to happen at the Schomburg Center. Today, Schomburg steward 75 works by Jacob Lawrence. This includes paintings, single silk screens, as well as lithographs. The John Brown series represents the bulk of our holdings of Jacob Lawrence. So one of the things that I wanted to point to as we begin the conversation is just the importance of building the archive, of collecting the things that at one point were not seen as the most important, but that are the most critical as we try to reconstruct what the Black past has been here in the United States. Thank you. You can visit us at www.nypl.org/location/Schomburg, or you can visit us in person at 135th Street and Malcolm X Boulevard in Harlem. Thank you. And I'm going to pass it on to Elizabeth Hutton Turner.
Thank you so much, Joy. That was so terrific, and I look forward to our conversation at the end. Let me see, again, this awkward moment of screen sharing here. So I think this is a great celebration of the Schomburg, as it should be, as far as I'm concerned. The Schomburg is the well, the great source of Lawrence's struggle series, and understanding how the Schomburg played a vital role in Jacob Lawrence's research and reading as a painter of historical narrative is so important. And I thought, sort of looking back, we ought to see among his earliest paintings is a portrait of Arthur Schomburg. And thinking about the photographs of the Schomburg, the early photographs of the Schomburg library that Joy has shown us, again, you can see the references to sculpture, to the different media, and this painting, which dates from 1937, and a year before Schomburg dies. We have him seated as an older man and still hard at work, and with a document in his hands, ever vigilant, ever clear about his dedication to telling history that has not been told and needs to be told. He's a role model, and he also is someone in Lawrence's life who issued a mandate to tell history, to reveal history, to show this. It was a vital component of culture and a vital component of identity. Certainly Lawrence's own identity. From the start, he identified with this mission and his capacity to read history and to create a visual synthesis. He was always confident in his invention, which came early on in his career, of combining words with same-sized panels. I'm showing you here a comparison of his one of his most famous series, of course, is The Migration of the Negro, created in 1941 when Lawrence was only 24 years old. 60 same-sized panels with captions based upon the writings of Emmett Scott and Carter Woodson. He emulated the voice of a third-person narrator, providing information regarding causes and effects, but also in his sequencing, you already see his propensity for showing hard truths and also terrible ironies in those sequences. And so here you have in the Migration series, panel 52, you have him demonstrating that the trip from the rural South to the urban North and the accommodation there was not without violence and resistance, not without struggle. So it's embedded in his telling of this missing chapter of American history. He tells it on, it's a story he begins telling about the era of World War I and the need for labor in Northern industry. And then he tells it on the eve of World War II, 1941. He tells it almost as a cautionary tale of how this next battle is the African-American contribution to this next battle is equally important. But his showing of the struggle in the migration series, I think, is very clear. Notice the really strong distinction between figure and ground here. You've got some really, the idea strikes right away of how and when the conflict is occurring. 15 years later, Lawrence is honing his narrative invention, reading ever more deeply into all kinds of primary and secondary sources in American history, once again returning to the Schomburg Library. And we have a different kind of figure-ground relationship, a much more gnarled and collected combination of shapes, abstracted shapes. And so we see how Lawrence is using, by the time of the struggle series, he's going to have a different approach to words and images. The images are going to be abstracted, and it will take time to review and one needs to invest time in finding the main protagonist and understanding what it is to be in the midst of struggle. And so Lawrence will also have these accompanied by voices from the time frame, or he will have a simple declaration of the subject, which in this case is Massacre in Boston. His methods, Lawrence's methods in researching history and reading history, he's again takes his cue from the assiduous researchers and the reference librarians of the vertical files at the Schomburg. I can tell you, I looked at this photo many times before I really understood what was at work here. I knew research was at work, but the type of research. And so I started looking at what was actually happening on those tables, looking at the trash can beside the table, and looking in particular at the figure, the librarian in the foreground, who is actually creating a kind of scrapbook, if you will, of these vertical, these clippings out of newspapers and magazine articles that concern periods of history that reference African Americans in history. So it's a kind of collecting and concentration and archiving to support the kind of research that needed to go on there at the Schomburg. Joy has shown you the reference to Crispus Attucks in the vertical files at the Schomburg. I was so excited to see this and to know that, you know, what you come to find out when you explore this vertical file is that there were campaigns to have a national holiday. So in the 20th century, African-American communities were looking to celebrate Crispus Attucks as the first martyr of the American Revolution, to celebrate the African-American contribution to American history and to recognize the sacrifice of all the people in creating America. In Lawrence's library series, which he had painted libraries before, but in earnest, he constructs a series around 1960. And this is this is actually the second of that series from 1960. And you can see there is the librarian sharing information with young people. And you can see on her lap, to my eye, are clippings. And it makes me think of the reference librarian that is actually positioning these clippings in a kind of scrapbook arrangement. We know that Lawrence, in his choosing to emphasize the massacre at Boston. He focuses only on the Americans, not on who they are resisting. And enshrined in this crowd, he has the first martyr of the revolution, and that is Crispus Attucks, front and center in the foreground. But it is the body of the people that creates this kind of shrine, if you will, pictorially speaking. We do not see the people they are fighting. And this is a largely a departure from what Paul Revere created, the engraving of the sort of propaganda that Paul Revere wanted to put forward almost immediately upon this occurrence. And you can see, again, the crowd of people, but you also see his emphasis is upon the fact that the British soldiers are gunning down the Americans. And what Lawrence is wanting to highlight is Crispus Attucks, and also as part of this larger group, and also to see them as marginalized, throwing rocks and rocks against guns. Lawrence chose to emphasize the resistance of the Americans to the British occupation. Another composition that really deals with absence rather than presence in some ways is Lawrence's rendering of the Hamilton Burr duel. You can see on the right, one of Lawrence's sources, America in Pictures, which really provides a great kind of straw man for Lawrence to say, okay, here's the iconic image in the history books. Here is the picture of the duel. And a duel, of course, is two people. The idea that it's a clandestine activity, it's something that was secreted away from New York City in Weehawken. This is also indicated in the print that you see on the right. Lawrence adapts that idea, and you see this very mysterious sequestered space. We're not exactly sure of the location, but we see it as something that is happening in secret. But by leaving Burr out of the picture, what happens, and leaving it only Burr's representation only as a shadow in the center, is that he is creating a sense that Hamilton is being assassinated. Further underscoring that idea, the conservators of this picture have shown us where there is, Lawrence once had the gun, Hamilton's gun dropping from his hand, and that has been covered over. So unarmed victim of an armed assailant is the implication of the image. Another part of this, of course, is the fruitless irony of the duel itself, which is underscored by the juxtaposition of this image with the text. I shall hazard much and can possibly, I'm sorry, I'm not able to say it, possibly gain nothing by the issue of the interview. And of course, this was written in a letter to Hamilton's wife that was only to be opened or read upon his death. So it indicates the tragedy, the terrible loss of this form of resolving a political dispute. One could also think about calculating the loss for America. Hamilton's relationship with slavery, the issue of slavery, is complicated, but it was thought that his membership in the New York Manumission Society was a sign of his advocacy for abolitionism. And yet we know that Hamilton is married into a family of slaveholders. So, so he has, again, a very contradictory relationship with the history of enslaved people.
Beth, can you maybe just say a few final closing thoughts? I don't know what you have next.
Let's see. Have you taken over the screen or can I continue?
No, I haven't.
Okay. I just pointing out Lawrence's reading, his sources for this work. It comes from a petition of enslaved people. Lawrence would have found this text in Herbert Apteker's book relating to American Negro slave revolts, which was published in 1943, but which eventually became these documents, this documentary history eventually became part of a 7-volume series. What's interesting about this, of course, is that Lawrence chooses the complaint of Felix: we have no property, we have no wives, no children, no city, no country. This is slavery robs the humanity from people and the culture from people. And so what Lawrence chooses to, even though the petition itself begs the judges to understand that this is a peaceable, lawful application for freedom from the Massachusetts legislature, and notice that it's prior to the revolution, that in fact Lawrence wants you to know that there was this violent resistance to enslavement, and again, a cautionary note to know that to deny the petitioner here is also to understand that there will be resistance, there will be violent resistance, even though the actual document that Lawrence is reading pleads otherwise. But you can see that Lawrence has no trouble demonstrating just how violent and bloody it is. And Apteker is a hugely important source for Lawrence, and is someone who was among the first to be able to compile the literally this monumental factual compilation that makes it absolutely clear just how this resistance took shape and was a part of the American struggle from the beginning. So you see here, I just want to rush to the very end, because I know one of the other questions we were asked to think about in terms of Lawrence's research and historical documentation was, how do we see the series as a whole? And this is actually one of the, well, actually, maybe given the terrible anniversary that Joy brought up of Emmett Till's murder, maybe this becomes a really important point we want to make, and that is that Lawrence, as he was painting these scenes from American history, was very well aware of current events and being able to incorporate the continued struggle for freedom and justice. And so there is literally a visual quotation in this image and a correlation with Ernest Withers' photograph of Mose Wright, who was Emmett Till's uncle, who at the risk of his own life testified at the trial and identified the murderers of Emmett Till, his nephew. And those are strong words, words that defy death. And he points out the murderers. And as you can see here, there's a pointing figure here with a gun. And here are the people outside of the convention hall hearing the words of Patrick Henry. And this is a famous notion associated with Patrick Henry's speech, that the words were so powerful that people standing outside the hall were moved. One man, the story is told, one man who was by the window listening said that he wanted, when his time came, to be buried by that window because he was so struck with by Patrick Henry's word of conviction about freedom. And of course, we all remember, give me liberty or give me death, which is the last line of the speech. But Lawrence chooses the next to the last line of the speech. And that is life so dear or peace so sweet to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Those words haunt us to this very day. And they haunt American history. They provide the basis of struggle and resistance. And I'll leave it there.
Stephen, take it away.
Hi, folks. I have sort of short version of everything my esteemed colleagues have said. And my work as a painter, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that Jacob Lawrence is probably one of the greatest painters this country has ever produced, and that his innovation in the craft of painting is brought about by his necessity to find a new form to talk about American history. Lawrence isn't painting Black history, he's painting American history. And here's the thing about struggle, is that it is the condition of American life. Colson Whitehead, the writer who wrote The Underground Railroad, wrote a lesser known book called Aphex Hides the Hurt, which is about a town that needs to have its name redone. They hire a name consultant to come up with a new name for the town. And the name that this man selects for the town is struggle, right? So what if struggle is the condition of American life? What if it's not something to be overcome? What if it is the water in which we swim, right? So looking at Migration, which is a masterwork, which is at the Phillips, I think, so you can go see it, which is really exciting, and see it up against struggle. So you'll see what I'm actually talking about in this short talk. Lawrence is a master of complementary color relationships. So the ways that he's making a few colors feel like many, many more colors just by the use of the way that they're deployed in a series. And the way one color can become multiple things. So the way that the red dresses also become the red signs, right? So two different objects made of two different materials painted with the same color, but he's still able to communicate that they're two different things. Also, the thing that to notice with Lawrence before struggle is the roundness of the forms. He's making these very incredible paintings with these tremendous inventions in terms of shape. It is very hard to paint something and to give it a shape, to paint a three-dimensional object in a two-dimensional form and give it a shape that conveys its three-dimensional reality, okay? That's what I'm trying to say. And Lawrence does that over and over again. The other thing to notice in the work before struggle is how open and airy it feels. There's a tremendous amount of negative space that Lawrence uses in Migration that activates the people. So you start to see a form surrounded by a larger form. And that larger green form starts to push those ochre colored people forward. And then you realize that the people are the same color as the table. So how does he do that with the same color, make it feel like two distinct sorts of things? And the key with Lawrence is this understanding of complementary color relationships. And not since Bonnard has anyone mixed a more luminous gray. That gray at the top of this painting, A Family, 1943, is what makes that yellow sing behind the family. And then that same yellow is in the child's dress. And then the father sort of becomes a different shade or different tint, excuse me, of the blue that's on the floor. So as a colorist, Lawrence really has no peer, right? And as someone who can invent in terms of shape, that mother, that red shape that makes the mother is a shape that contains strength and also comfort. And that's an invented shape. You know, Lawrence came up with that shape in order to convey that idea, right? And the idea of the rounded form starts to make these figures expand in a way. So they fill the space. So you sort of get the sense, almost like paper dolls or puzzle pieces, that you could pull the people out of the painting completely intact as forms of color, right? So that's up until 1948. And then we get to struggle. And something very, very different happens here, because this is no longer about comfort or safety or family or anything. It's about America. And what is America? Jacob Lawrence is a Black man in the 50s who's decided that he has the right and the responsibility to talk about America, not Black America, America, right? And he does it by shifting the way that he's making his work. He shifts into this color relationship, which has a tremendous amount of heat and weight to it, using a lot of reds and a lot of yellows, ochres that have a lot of physical weight as substance, and also by changing the way that he renders shape. The shapes become angular and sharp and pointed in a way that is so antithetical to what we've seen before. Even the figures themselves, the people themselves, start to take on an angularity that they don't have in migration, right? And that this thing that Dr. Hutton Turner talked about with this idea of irony, the positioning of a text with the image, this image is paired with the opening words of our Constitution, not the Black Constitution, the American Constitution, right? So Lawrence has access to that. And also there's something really interesting here as well, that Lawrence knows how to make a Caucasian flesh tone, but he chooses in almost every instance to make people the color of ochre, the color of earth, the color of dirt. So all of us Americans come from the same mass, right? And you can see in this image here where we're pairing the first panel of migration and a crowd, and the, like I said, the sort of bulbous complementary color relationships, all that sort of stuff, versus this sort of angular, slashing, brutal image of our Constitution, right? So America is forged out of struggle. And in order to image America, Lawrence had to find a new way to image his own work. And he did it by manipulating color and shape in these really specific ways, but never losing sight of this idea and this possibility of beauty. And this is the last image I want to talk about. This, of course, like Dr. Hutton Turner talked about, is the Hamilton-Burr duel. I don't need to say anything more about that. But what I want you to notice is that in the violence of the loss of Hamilton, look at how beautiful America is in the background. That's what Lawrence gives us. He gives us this sort of terrible beauty of America, the very, very difficult married with the very, very beautiful. And in images like this, and like Peace, and the surrender painting that's in Struggle, you see this sort of marriage of the terrible and the beautiful right up against each other. And I can't think of anything more American than that. That's all I got.
All right, no, thank you all. Why don't I get Beth back on? And Beth, are you able to come back on your video? I know, I'm sorry we had to rush through. There's so much to say. I know that we really aren't going to be able to obviously conquer this subject. So we really are just hoping to pique everyone's interest to learn more. And I hope you will all study the catalog further and come to the exhibition. But I do want to throw out at least one question to my distinguished panelists, and then see if our audience would like to ask anything. And that is to really pick up on this thread about the struggle then and now, and really what one of the other things I think that makes Lawrence, as you've said, Stephen, so peerless in a way, is that his work does speak so much to today, just as strongly as it did to the audiences in the 1950s. And I'm just wondering, you know, in 1961, when just a few years after he had completed the struggle, when Lawrence spoke about not being fearful that his work would be seen as propaganda, what message do you think the struggle series had for audiences in the 1950s? And what continued resonances and messages might it carry today? So I know that's a heavy question, but I'd love to just get some thoughts from the whole group here about that aspect of Lawrence, art as propaganda.
I think that, you know, struggle 1951, that sort of moment where Lawrence is painting struggle. Think about who he is, right? He's like probably like one of the best known, quote unquote, Black American artists in the country, who's making images about Black people and Black things, right? And then he decides to take on the entire scope of American history. And so it's no longer images, it's no longer able to be dismissed as genre painting by a white audience. It's no longer about Black people, now it's about all of us, right? And I think that that may have been very hard for people to accept, that a Black artist was talking about America instead of staying in his lane, right? And I think that in this moment, like when I first met Dr. Hutton Turner and she asked me to work on this project, I thought what a miracle it is that this work came back now, like in this moment when we have like so many artists who are dealing with archive and history and representation and authorship, right? What a moment to have this work come back and to be instructive to us. So I think that he painted it. It's gonna sound weird for me to say this. I think he painted struggle for 2021. I don't think he painted it for the 50s. I don't think that the people in the 50s could have seen what he was really, really doing.
I think Steve is right. I'm just going to jump in here. That the people in the 50s did not see this. They did not want to see it. They were blind to it. And the idea that this was some kind of vivid, vibrant illustration of history was certainly accepted. And even his value as a colorist was accepted, but not the content. And you know, to call this propaganda was also, it was a debate between Locke and not this Steve Locke, but Elaine Locke, and W.B. Du Bois. And W.B. Du Bois made it quite clear that you needed to emphasize, select and emphasize struggle and sacrifice and blood, and to understand what undergirds that. And Lawrence was perfectly ready to emphasize that in his work. And the last thing I just want to say is that what he is pushing here is saying, we're not just going to edit the images of American history. We're not just adding, a figure here or there. We're reconceiving, we're revisualizing a whole new picture. That's the revolution of the struggle series.
I suppose I'm thinking of it a little bit differently in terms of the archive itself and the building of archives and the collection of content that one cannot necessarily see at the moment why it's important. You kind of know it's important, but its real significance doesn't really manifest until after the time that it is collected, which is always a struggle first in terms of making decisions about what should comprise this archive. The place where I think the Schomburg is so significant in a conversation about what you said, Steve, Lawrence creating for 2021. In many ways, that's what Arturo Schomburg is doing. He's collecting for a time that doesn't yet exist, because at the time that he was collecting, the folks were like, what are you doing? And or didn't think it was important. And now those papers, those archives, those works by artists who were marginalized at the moment are now the stuff that we want to mine for right now. So I think just to piggyback off that idea that the creative enterprise, which archival collection is not necessarily time-based or based in the present. It is really about what's to come. It's about the future.
And I do think Lawrence is doing his own kind of archiving, as you say, and adopting those methods that we can benefit from. I think that's a great thought. I completely affirm that. I really think it's something that can be a project that can be continued.
And that, I think that's sort of a very good segue to a thought I was thinking about. This tour, it's been an incredible tour, but it's the first time, as I said, in over half a century, it's been reunited. There's still so much more to learn, as going back to what I said, and discover. So what might be a lingering question each of you might have? Is there a work in particular that there's something still that you're really hoping to get to the bottom of or understand better? Is there some other question that has surfaced in the course of you working on Struggle that might be an interesting way to think about what more we can do moving forward with the study of this series?
You know, personally, I think about two. One is the sort of influence of the compositional structures on the later paintings. So paintings like Library, there's a lot of crowded space in the later Lawrence work. You know, almost everything in Struggle is in medias res. You're like in the middle of something. The horizons are compressed and they're a little bit claustrophobic. And some of that carries over, like that beautiful image that Joy showed of the library, where there's like everyone is stacked up on top of each other. And so that sort of abstract cubist space becomes very, very prominent in the later work. But the other thing, Elsa, is like there's 30 paintings that didn't get made. Mm-hmm. There's another 30 paintings that didn't get made. So there's like what was he going to take on? And you think about like all the stuff that happened from 1954 to 1958, like the bloodbath that was this country. You know, and I think that what he didn't paint, what he didn't get to paint is always gonna occupy my thinking. Yeah.
What about you or Joy or Beth?
Joy, do you wanna go?
Sure, I do think what he didn't get to paint occupies my thinking. And because I typically am reading not just looking for underrepresentation racially, but also gender-wise, I'm also wondering what would this look like if it were gendered, if Lawrence had made a more conscious decision. I mean, he includes the one woman, which I think is fabulous, because it did give me the jumping off point to be like, oh my God, we talk about Schomburg all the time, Arturo, when really a good deal of the work happens under this woman whose name we don't invoke nearly as much. And so I wonder, like, if Jacob Lawrence revisited this from a gender perspective, what the struggle series would look like.
I think the thing that inspires me is this prospect of this additive quality of the archive and the clipping file, and the fact that Lawrence's friend Jay Lida, who was the former film curator of MoMA, had published something called the Melville Log, and it was a kind of, if you will, kind of a crowdsourced biography of Melville, but it was made from snippets of primary sources that were meant to be added to. And when it was published in 1951, but it was meant to be continued. And that's the way I feel about the struggle series, that these selections, this reading of these texts, the visualization from the text, the picking of the quotes, the moving forward, it's an inspiration to all of us. And secondly, I want to know where the missing panels are. That's the I'm not giving up.
Yeah.
I'm going to put a pitch out there, for example, there's one that does not have an image, but only a subject, and that is spindles. And of course, my mind starts spinning with those spindles, and I think about the spinning mule, and I think about industrialization of enslaved people in this. I mean, it makes me want to know how he would have conveyed that. And I know it's out there. That
Right.
thing is out there somewhere.
Right.
We must find it.
Well, I know we're slightly over, but we have a very captive
who
audience.
cares?
But I want to know. So if you guys, your panels are willing to stay with us, and the participants, I have a really good question in our Q&A. So I do want to.
Well, I have time. I just ordered a pizza. It's not going to be here for long.
So we're
Great.
ready. I've got my pajamas. We're ready.
Yeah, I got nothing going on. Yeah.
So let me share this question in our chat from Phil Brookman. How exactly does Lawrence's struggle help us understand the process of struggle today? How exactly does Lawrence's struggle help us understand the process of struggle today?
Well, I can't sort of stress this enough, right? That struggle in America, struggle is productive. It is productive. It's not something to avoid. It's not something to deny. It's productive. It's how we become more American. Like, it's that kind of thing where we talk about the American struggle. And it was so beautiful that Joy started with the definitions. It was so beautiful that she started with that, because that's what it's about. Like, if we take the connotation out, it's like when, in the spiritual, God is going to trouble the water, that doesn't mean that the water is going to be bad. That means that the water is going to be charged, right? It's going to have power, right? And so when we talk about struggle, this is what Lawrence is telling us. He's like, this is what America is. It is this conflict. It is this battle. It is this discussion. It is this sort of bumping of forces up against each other. And even like, if something as like terrible as Antietam, or something as terrible as the Hamilton Burr duel, look at how beautiful America is. Look at how beautiful it is, right? That's what I think it has to teach us today.
I have two things to say about that. One has to do precisely with where I think you're going, Steve, which has to do with it cannot be one or the other, or this at the exception of that. I think part of what is beautiful about the struggle series is an inclusion of actors that we don't always talk about when we discuss the formation of the country. I mean, I feel like the Civil War gets a lot of love, and that kind of riff gets a lot of love, but this early formation of the nation and all of the various actors who were part of that. Part of what I think is interesting about it is you can't really understand the struggle if you don't have that knowledge.
Right.
And so it's offering us an intervention, I think, in the narrative of the early republic, which is it's always for me better to look at an image of it than to read a tome about it. So it's also a different approach to learning. The second thing I'll say is I think there are ethos where cultural ethos that exists where struggle is not a bad thing, nor is it expected that it's not going to happen. I feel that within, at least within the Black American tradition, the struggle, the trouble don't last always, but there's trouble, there's struggle, you're striving. These are things that are part of the ways in which we discuss our DNA. It has always been a struggle here. Right. And we frame a future or maybe even a past where that did not exist, but I don't know that that is realistic. I think it is, it's a ground on which we stand. The idea that you'll struggle and you'll overcome and then you'll struggle again. Right. So it's not a bad thing to struggle. It's a bad thing to struggle and not learn anything.
I think the interesting thing that Lawrence's images teach us is this fabric of America that he is constructing with these colors and shapes and forms. You definitely get a sense that we're in this together and nobody gets out of it unless we consider what it is to be a democracy, which means that we lean on each other. No one's free until we're all free. No one succeeds unless you create the opportunity for everyone. I mean, there is this, if you look at those images, you see the bodies intertwined and together. And there is a sense that it's when we come to understand that we are together.
Well, that couldn't be a better way to close. You guys are so eloquent and have been such wonderful insights have come forth from your presentations and your study. We've had a wonderful audience, even if we couldn't be in the same room. As Beth said, if you look around on the walls, if you happen to spot any works that look like the struggle, we really hope they'll turn up. So you're charged with that after this program. And please, if you have a chance to be in Washington, the exhibition's got a few more weeks and we'll hope you'll come and see it for yourself or see it again until September 19th. So again, thank you to you all, Stephen, Joy, and Beth, and our audience. Thank you, Miguel, my colleague, for handling.
Yes, Miguel. Thank you.
Yes. And I wish everyone a wonderful rest of your weekend. Thanks so much again.
Thanks.
Bye. So great to see you all. Thank you.
It was so wonderful to do this with you. I could have listened to the two of you all day. I totally forgot that I had to speak. Because I was like totally listening to what you were, I was just so rapt.
Let's meet up in DC.
Oh yeah, definitely. All right.
Well, you guys should just come to the Schomburg.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna have a pizza delivered down there. That's what I'll do. That's great.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Also, thank you so much, my friend. It was really great.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.